2. Walter de la Mare's A, B, O. The text for the context. Natura nihil agit frustra is the only indisputable axiom in philosophy. There are no grotesques in nature, not anything framed to fill up empty cantons and unnecessary spaces. There is therefore no deformity but in monstrosity, wherein notwithstanding there is a kind of beauty, nature so ingeniously contriving those irregular parts, as they become sometimes more remarkable than the principal fabric. To speak yet more narrowly, there was never anything ugly, or misshapen, but the chaos, wherein notwithstanding, to speak strictly, there was no deformity, because no for me, nor was it yet impregnate by the voice of God. Now nature is not at variance with art, nor art with nature, they being both the servants of his providence. Art is the perfection of nature, were the world now as it was the sixth day, there were yet chaos. Nature hath made one world, and art another. In brief, all things are artificial, for nature is the art of God. Sir Thomas Browne, Religio Medici, 1642. Legions of grotesques sweep under his hand, for has not nature to her grotesques the rent rock, the distorting lights of evening on lonely roads, the unveiled structure of man in the embryo, or the skeleton? Walter Pater, Leonardo da Vinci, 1869. The plots of God are perfect. The universe is a plot of God. Edgar Allan Poe, Eureka, 1848. Behold, I shew you a mystery. The Book of Common Prayer, 1552. In A Revenant, 1936, in homage to Edgar Allan Poe, Walter de la Mare tacitly acknowledges his fascination with the effluvia or the miasma of the Gothic when his narrator, a professor who grudgingly concedes the virtues of Poe's works while decrying his personal failings, observes that the most salient, the most impressive feature of Poe's writings is his own personal presence in them. Even in his most exotic fantasies, some of them beautiful in the sense that the phosphorescence of decay, the brambles and briars of the ruinous, the stony calm of the dead may be said to be beautiful, some so sinister and macabre in their half-demented horror that if we ourselves encountered them even in dreams we should awake screaming upon our beds. Even here the sense of his peculiar personality is so vivid and immediate that, as we read, it is almost as if the poet himself stood in the flesh before us. Point 1. Although this scarcely amounts to unqualified praise, the exotic fantasies and half-demented horrors are offered as symptoms of the peculiar personality that had conceived them. De la Mare had not always been so laudatory. Edgar Allan Poe, 1909, an earlier appreciation written in propria persona, echoes Henry James in depicting Poe as a literary seducer of naive cities in early youth. He admitted, before experience has taught one to appreciate the charms of sobriety in literature as well as in life, that Poe waylays his victim and as someone whose indiscreet confidences impart a dubious sort of knowledge. If life on earth be but a brief series of reminiscences, then Poe has whispered in our ear many that might more prudently have been left undisturbed. Two perhaps more telling than these explicit reproaches, however, is the fact that A Revenant contains a coded tribute to Poe, for embedded in the passage cited above is a phrase borrowed from Baudelaire, who identified la phosphorescence de la Purger as the telltale signifier of decadence in literature. Point 3. In purloining Baudelaire's phrase, de la Mare invokes the memory of the poet who first translated Poe's works into French, not only because Baudelaire sought, as he wrote in his preface to Histoires Extraordinaires, 1856, to add a new saint to the martyrology of illustrious unfortunate men, too rich in poetry and passion, who came to serve the harsh apprenticeship of genius among inferior souls, but also because he believed that no man has told about the exceptions in human life and in nature with more magic the enthusiastic curiosities of convalescence, the dying seasons charged with enervating splendors, hot, humid and misty weather when the south wind softens and relaxes one's nerves like the strings of an instrument. Point 4. De la Mare is also re-emphasizing, however, the specific predilection that the decadents had found most admirable in Poe as they developed their own literary aesthetic in which conditions otherwise contradistinct and oppositional were made to coalesce. Such hints and linkages, an American professor of English characterizes the dead Poe in terms put forth by a French decadent, suggest that de la Mare approached Poe with a curious admixture of guilty pleasure and skittish attraction. In his popular role as the decorous and conventional singer of the songs of childhood, 1902, however, de la Mare betrayed few of the dark conceits that another self, more private and more given to bizarrerie and outre, would nurture in some of his horror stories. Later, during the prime of his own career, de la Mare expressed his thoughts on the obscure literary motives, inclinations, and allegiances of writers of fiction, proposing that they are nowadays inclined to be reticent, if they have any secrets, they keep them dark. 5. His own inner, private life, his own affinities with those other Victorians, those who, as Baudelaire said of Poe, created in order to show that strangeness is one of the integral parts of the beautiful, or sought to demonstrate that, as Ruskin put it, the beautiful itself is continually mingled with the shadow of death, were such secrets most nearly betrayed in A, B, O, one of de la Mare's earliest and only recently exhumed tales of horror. Point 6. Like the treasure it describes, A, B, O lay buried for more than half a century, and it was only just before his death in 1956 that de la Mare, by then a companion of honor and possessor of the Order of Merit and obviously less concerned than in earlier years about the effect its publication might have on his reputation, agreed to sanction the ghoulish proceedings that his friend Edward Wagenknecht had set in motion when he set out to collect and reprint his early stories. During the 5 decades between its birth and possible first publication circa 1895 and de la Mare's consenting to its inclusion in a collection titled 8 Tales, which appeared eventually in 1971, de la Mare apparently saw his A, B, O as something that ought to be kept hidden. Point 7. In the intervening years, like the disgraced parent of a blighted offspring, he remained silent as to the hiding place of his story of buried corruption. At the last, however, apparently unwilling that any part of his legacy should be lost, he allowed Wagenknecht to raise it from the dead. Always self-deprecatory, de la Mare professed to believe that his early stories were amateurish, not merely ill-conceived but poorly crafted, and yet A, B, O is an accomplished piece of work, full of nervous description and elusive, cryptic dialogue that successfully conveys an atmosphere of delirium, hallucination, and half-demented horror. As is the case with a number of de la Mare's early efforts, it is quite self-consciously derivative and literary in style. It is more, however, than a literary pastiche, revealing the adroitness with which a young writer appropriated images and phrases from the works of precursors as diverse as Jeremy Taylor, Sir Thomas Browne, Hawthorne, Poe, and Pater. A. B. O is a quintessential example of a certain sort of fin de siècle conceit that flourished in the twilight of the Victorian era. Monstrous offspring such as Wells's The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1896, Vernon Lee's Hauntings, 1890, Chambers is the King in Yellow, Shields Shapes in the Fire, 1896, X.Lsaut Diabolus Aut Nihil and Other Tales, 1894, and Stoker's Dracula, 1897, all of which were published in the 1890s and all of which embodied the conflict between the urge to continue to believe in what John Buchan referred to as the old noble commonplaces of love and faith and duty that are always with us and a gnawing distrust of the literary and cultural past, in which such commonplaces were rooted. Point 8 to the extent that it reflects its author's interest in and compelling engagement with contemporary scientific theory and evolutionary biology and with embryology and recapitulation theory in particular. A. B. O displays the characteristic indicia of the day. Such historicist concerns, however, are subsumed within the encompassing semiotic play of a text that charts the difficulties confronting those who struggle to situate themselves within a universe of signs, barely legible missives, encoded maps, cryptic cognomens, and parabolic pronouncements that must be read, deciphered, and analyzed before its monstrous proportions may be apprehended, however imperfectly, however disastrous the consequences. All of these things make A. B. O valuable both as a text and as a document disclosing not merely anxieties and horrors, but also the distinctive mentality of an age, expressing itself in questions and concerns voiced by an apprentice writer who saw himself as a witness to both the death of one culture and the birth of its successor. As a horror story, A. B. O proceeds swiftly from the merely quaint to the genuinely horrific, leading us through a series of abominable events that begin benignly enough when Pelluver, the story's narrator, receives a scrawled message from his friend Dugdale in which he discerns the magical word antiquities. With an old map left by Dugdale's great uncle as a guide, the two set about excavating Dugdale's garden, the site of what they hope will prove to be buried treasure. After a good deal of digging, hauling, and scraping, the two unearth an old metal chest that proves to be cryptic in more ways than one, for along its side is inscribed a word that time and soil have partially eroded. Only the puzzling fragment A. B. O remains. Prying open the lid of the chest, they find neither gold nor jewels nor pearls of great price, but a shriveled creature wrapped in yellow cotton wool, its skull and features bearing a hideous and ungodly resemblance to the human face. 9 and then, even more horribly, they discover that although it has been buried for many years, the creature is still somehow alive, its casket having been provided with a metal pipe that links it to the boss of a yew tree overhead. Terrified, the two men decide to rebury their treasure, but the creature escapes before they have an opportunity to do so, and when last seen it is pattering off toward the heart of London. In the end, Pelluver returns to Dugdale's home only to discover that his friend, now hopelessly insane, has taken the place of the homunculus within the chest. Although this brief synopsis omits a great deal of the story's plot, it suggests that in writing A. B. O. the young Delamere had quite consciously appropriated several literary traditions and conventions primarily, however, in order to put them to ironic use. With its requisite black cat, yew tree, and late-night dig, for example, A. B. O. recalls the early Gothic romances of Anne Radcliffe or Monk Lewis. But whereas such romances often contain little more than the sum of their physical horrors, the bleeding nun, the rapist monks, so that once these have been explained away or disposed of in one fashion or another, the reader is left with little but the recollection of a brush with the unheimlich, the mystifications of Delamere's story pale beside a horror whose unveiling has little to do with such Gothicized excrescences. Predicated as it is upon the traditional theme of buried treasure, A. B. O. also emphasizes its own antiquarianism, its obsession with the past and with historiography, as embodied in a map that marks the site of antiquities and in the feckless seekers after forbidden knowledge. Such quests were the favorite protagonists of the writers of the antiquarian ghost stories of the period, most notably M.R. James, whose Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, 1904, features the scholars, professors, pedants, curators, and collectors best suited to the taste of the Canterburyans who for years gathered at his hearthside to hear his annual Yuletide ghost story. The scholar/narrator of the Delamere story is first seen poring over a book, although he glances up occasionally at the portrait of the great-grandfather who will preside over the tragedy that is about to occur. Dugdale, the friend whose missive lures him from the cozy sanctity of his study, bears the name of Sir William Dugdale, the Warwickshire antiquary distinguished for his tireless investigations into histories, origins, pedigrees, and precedents, and author of the Antiquities of Warwickshire, 1656, and Antiquities of the Inns of Court and Chancery, 1666. Point 10. The treasure buried at the heart of Delamere's story is not the sword for which adventurers and antiquarians usually seek, however not the gold to which his knowledge of Latin and an agile mind led the scholarly Mr. Somerton in James's The Treasure of Abbot Thomas. 1904 nor the abundant riches heaped upon Poe's studiously eccentric William Legrand, who successfully decodes a cryptograph of Captain Kidd's devising, recorded on the scrap of parchment to which Legrand is led by the eponymous gold bug. In Delamere's story, the successful transcription of an ancestral map discloses only a little lower layer of mystification, a palimpsestic reality denominated by the hieroglyphic A, B, O, the exact meaning and nature of which remains a matter for almost endless speculation. History and their own complacent familiarity with an antiquarian tradition lead the two men to anticipate that their map records the burial place of old Roman or Druidical artifacts, but their treasure proves to be a loathsome abomination, and their experience in the unearthing of it that of the envisioned protagonist of one of Hawthorne's unwritten stories, the germ of which he had jotted down in the early 1840s in one of his notebooks. A man seeks for something excellent, but seeks it in the wrong way, and in the wrong spirit, and finds something horrible, as for instance, he seeks for treasure, and finds a dead body for the gold that somebody has hidden, and brings to light his accumulated sins. 11. Promising, in typically post fashion, to speak without emotion, Pelluver gives the following description of their treasure. I saw a flat malformed skull and meager arms and shoulders clad in coarse fawn hair. I saw a face thrown back a little, bearing hideous and ungodly resemblance to the human face, its lids heavy blue and closely shut with coarse lashes and tangled eyebrows. 97. The emphasis Delamere places on this ungodly resemblance is the first suggestion that the damnable thing, as Dugdale calls it, may also be thought of as an aborigine in the sense of primitive or, as the Oxford English Dictionary has it, first or earliest so far as history or science gives record. Delamere further hints that the A, B, O may be a biological throwback or reversion to type when he describes its face as thrown back a little, the phrase suggesting not merely the relation of head to body, but the creature's connection to the shadowy, hairy ancestor so familiar to later Victorians and Edwardians. The figure who is featured, for example, on the cover of A Child's History of Evolution, published in 1911, which tells the story of the caveman, figure 15. The children of such a figure appear in Wells's A Story of the Stone Age, 1897. Wild-eyed youngsters with matted hair and little broad-nosed impish faces, covered, as some children are covered even nowadays, with a delicate down of hair. They were narrow in the loins and long in the arms. And their ears had no lobes, and had little pointed tips, a thing that still, in rare instances, survives. Stark naked vivid little gypsies, as active as monkeys and as full of chatter, though a little wanting in words. 12 various clues point to at least one other possible interpretation of the inscrutable acronym A, B, O. One that, as we shall see, is related to the notion of an aboriginal. As the story unfolds, we come to suspect something more ominous still, and Peluther confirms our hypothesis when, far advanced in his adventure, he has a ghastly epiphany and stammers abortion abo, abortion, I knew then, 104. His friend, who has guessed independently that they have dug up a wretched abortion, gives an additional turn of the hermeneutic screw when he alludes to the gender of the aborted fetus, for his choice of pronoun, he, Peluther, tells us that the A, B, O is also a boy. 13. Willfully outre as his choice of subject may seem, even to our own case-hardened sensibilities, Delamere was not the first author to make human embryos and aborted fetuses the centerpiece of a fictive creation. In The Peach and Brandy, one of the stories collected in Horace Walpole's privately printed hieroglyphic tales, 1785, the Archbishop of Tuam stifles a violent coughing fit by gulping down what he takes to be a medicinal fruit of peach and brandy, little knowing that the restorative is in fact one of the premature twins that the Queen Mother has just aborted and that her conscientious butler has caught up in a glass. The 5-year-old Queen Grata alerts her mother to the Archbishop's unfortunate error in judgment as she cries, "Mama, Mama, the gentleman has eaten my little brother." 14 as an image of something begun but not completed, or completed only imperfectly and in an untimely manner, the abortion held particular appeal for the decadents, and for Aubrey Beardsley in particular, whose illustrations of this period are rife with what, in a letter regarding his forthcoming cover for the April 1896 issue of the Savoy Figure 16, he referred to as a little creature, not an infant but an unstrangled abortion. 15. It would have been impossible for Delamere not to have seen Beardsley's illustrations, given the notoriety of the artist through his affiliation with the infamous Yellow Book, a publication that, despite the brevity of its 3-year existence, and despite the fact that much of what it published was quite innocuous, had come to be known as a repository of decadence. Embryonic creatures creep into Beardsley's illustrations for Lucian's True History, 1894, figure 17 and 18, and a sultry Madonna smiles lazily upon a human fetus in a drawing called Incipit Vita Nova, c. 1893, figure 19. Human embryos emerge as well in some of Beardsley's illustrations for Salome, 1894, figures 20 and 21, in a headpiece designed for St. Paul's depicts an embryo under glass, the object of study for the genteel young woman seated beside it, figure 22. Individual vignettes from Dance Bon Mot series, 1893-94, figures 23A-23D, feature the embryo in various modes, as the tuxedo gentleman monk, for example, or as a death's head fetus from out of whose skull ascends a skeletal man, an unveiling of what Pater took to be one of nature's grotesques, the unveiled structure of man in the embryo, or the skeleton, or even as the fetus grimly returned by the abortionist to its mother, what one might conceive of as the artistic rendering of the procured abortion that Beardsley would later praise good old Collins for having managed for him. 16. Judged within the larger context of his graphic work, Beardsley's homoculi allude to what Eva Curie, in her study of the grotesque iconography of the fin de siècle, identifies as the deadly secrets and dangers of sex. 17. The artist himself identified the masks of apes, of men and women, of little embryons as being among those donned by the guest who supped with the frogless Venus and Tannhauser in one of the many preambles to sexual play featured in Under the Hill, 1896, his mock erotic version of the medieval legend. 18. Seated in the leaden coffin that once contained the abortion, Dugdale identifies the pestilent secret sin that they have uncovered as a sin perhaps of yours and of mine, an observation that refers less to the disclosure of inconsequent retribution for ancestral misconduct, the proverbial sins of the fathers visited upon the sons, than to the matter of its unveiling. For Peluther's and Dugdale's own obsession with the past, expressed in their compulsive curiosity and their frenzied digging, is itself eroticized, continually forcing its way through the thin veneer of social breeding and expressing itself in terms of violence. The very language of Dugdale's missive is telling. The word antiquity seems to Peluther to be the peak of the climax of the summons. The golden word, 89. When he arrives at Dugdale's house, he finds his friend with cheeks flushed with excitement, 89-90, and in the garden Dugdale, spade in hand, digs feverishly, muttering something about city dinners, orgies, and looking to Peluther like a man in search of his soul. After the expenditure of much fanatical energy, we are told, exquisitely, suddenly, Dugdale's pick struck heavily and hollowly, 92. Although they suspect that it may contain delicate merchandise, the two old boys in the plot, as they call themselves, are forced to pull and push vigorously at the chest, for the hole in which it rests has been made ragged and unequal by their violent exertions. The whole urges Dugdale, speaking associatively, cryptically, its desecration, 93-94. The box is spirited away to Dugdale's study, where the desecration continues in good earnest. In a cranny at the lid of the chest, Dugdale, the flames of the fire glitter upon his glasses, inserted the tool. There is resistance on the second jerk, his steel chisel snapped but armed. With another, he sets to work once again and this time is able to prise open the lid at the first effort, 96. A few minutes later, however, confronted by the contents of the chest, their mood changes. Peluther feels his gorge rise with the despair of life, while Dugdale sits on the floor, rocking to and fro with hands clasped over his knees and complaining that he is too weak now, 97, to rebury the guilty thing as though sapped by the rigors of sexual violation and suffering a form of postcoital tristesse. At this stage, Dugdale seems less reminiscent of Sir Thomas Browne's antiquarian correspondent than of the infamous purveyor of pornographic and seditious material, William Dugdale, a kingpin of pornography whom Ronald Pearsall describes as the nastiest of all the publishers of erotica, a thoroughly disagreeable person, blackmailer, and pornographer, adman and publisher, the slime of whose trail snaked its web through Russell Court, Drury Lane, WYCH Street, and Holywell Street, to its final destination in the House of Correction off of Gray's Inn Road, where Dugdale died in 1868.19. Much of the language and imagery employed by Delamere in this parody of an archaeological dig, then, has obvious sexual implications. The excavation as brutal rape, but the dig also reads as a diabolical delivery. Dugdale and Peluther acting the part of ghoulish surgeons or midwives, ripping from the belly of the earth a womb/tomb that incubates the undead. Immediately after he reads Dugdale's note, Peluther rushes from his house looking like a doctor, bent on enterprise of life or death. 89. Working by candlelight, and after great labor, these amateur resurrection men, Doug Dale's admission that theirs is as glum a trade as body snatching. 93. Conjures up the memory of McFarlane and Feds, Stevenson's more famous body snatchers, deliver the leaden box by means of spade, shovel, and pick, the tools usually reserved for burial. The birth imagery becomes overt when they make a strange and inexplicable discovery. A thickly rusted iron tube ran out from the top of the chest into the earth, and thence by surmise we traced it to the trunk of the dwarf yew tree, and, with the light of our candles, eventually discovered its termination embedded in a boss between two gnarled encrusted branches a few feet up. We were unable to drag out the chest without first disintering the pot. 93. Like a human fetus. Then, this box boasts its own umbilical cord, which Doug Dale must saw in half. Thus inverting the plea and the pater noster, the two fanatical antiquarians deliver themselves not from evil but to it. Having cleaned away the mold and rust, the horrific afterbirth that clings to the chest, they are able to see three letters, initial to a word which originally ran the whole width of the side, but the greater part of which had been rendered illegible by the action of the soil. Abo were the letters. 95. The leprous child of the sinner thus denominated takes its place in a fin de siècle portrait gallery of the emblematic blighted progeny, blasted issue, and decrepit offspring of those who have sinned in body or spirit. They lie in a direct line of descent from such ancestors as the crippled, and possibly syphilitic, son of the philandering Viscount Squanderfield in Plate 6 of Hogarth's Marriage Hollow Mode, 1745, or Hawthorne's Pearl, whom the Salem villagers regard as an imp of evil, emblem and product of sin, or the naturally delicate, wan and wistful Paul Dombey, who, at the age of 5, looked, and talked, like one of those terrible little beings in the fairy tales, who, at 150, or 200 years of age, fantastically represent the children for whom they have been substituted. 20. Toward the latter decades of the century, such children are more frequently portrayed as the syphilitic offspring of parents such as Emile Zola's Nana, the courtesan whose son Louis is a poor little fellow always ill, with an eczema on the back of his neck, and concretions forming in his ears, which pointed, it was feared, to the decay of the bones of the skull. With his spoiled blood, flabby flesh all out in yellow patches, and poor little face waxen and dumb and white, the child, never smiling and with a very old expression, is the repository of all the taints and infections that his strapping mother absorbs and transmits, but only once displays bodily. 21. Sarah Grant, no less severe than Zola, introduces the reader of the Heavenly Twins, 1893, to the speckled toad who is the diseased infant of Edith Bale, a clergyman's daughter who has contracted syphilis from her philandering husband. 22. Yet, although physically similar to these contaminated children, whose disease, although never explicitly named, could not have been rendered with greater clarity of detail. 23. The abortion of Delamere's story has less in common with them or with the abject fetus shown crouched amidst the swarming spermatozoa in Edward Munch's Madonna, 1894, figure 24, than with a different set of progeny, whose physical appearance does not betray them as nature's grotesques. Whether literally or symbolically, all of these beautiful grotesques Dorian Gray, the voluptuous creatures of Dracula. The Eloi have been conceived parthenogenetically, in a process that Margaret Homans, discussing the androcentric conditions under which the monster appears in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein 1818, describes as an elaborate circumvention of normal heterosexual procreation. 24. Despite the obvious fact that he has natural parents, Dorian Gray is more immediately the creation of Lord Henry, who imagines that to project one's soul into some gracious form, and let it tarry there for a moment, or to convey one's temperament into another as though it were a subtle fluid, or a strange perfume, would be the most satisfying joy left to us in an age so limited and vulgar as our own, an age grossly carnal in its pleasures, and grossly common in its aims. It is perhaps worth noting that the outcome of Lord Henry's efforts proves no less grossly common, his son's criminality expressing itself in commonplaces murder and suicide, while the sublimated carnality that he proposes recalls heterosexual intercourse in every way except for the conspicuous exclusion of the feminine, but the feminine continues to manifest itself in the feminized male. Without female involvement, on merit, and having nothing but his own interests to consider, Dr. Moreau creates a brood of Moreau horrors, cutting, stitching, and pressing various animals into the semblance of crippled and distorted men. 25. Dracula's single-mindedness, on the other hand, is as evident in his procreative activities as in everything else that he undertakes. His creatures, as he calls them, my jackals when I want to feed, begin as full-blown daughters and become the means by which he will beget ready-made sons. Your girls that you all love are mine already, he informs his pursuers, and through them you and others shall yet be mine. 26. Although a highly sublimated form of lovemaking is common enough among the Eloi, they pelt each other with flowers. Differentiation itself, sexual, occupational, behavioral, is lacking because the forces that necessitated it, the struggles, the hardships, the discords of life have ceased to operate. At a time in which the hateful grindstone of pain and necessity had been broken at last, in a land bereft of stinging bugs, contagious diseases, processes of putrefaction, connubial jealousy, and fierce maternity, it is unclear how the Eloi come into being at all. It is hard to imagine them emerging from the bloody flux of childbirth. 27. With their firm lips, children of science, and their eyes wives of the microscope. 90. Delamere's characters are so aggressively masculine that they betray their own anxieties in an idiom that is undeniably sexualized. In the course of unearthing their creature, for example, they usurp the feminine prerogative of reproduction. We nursed our excitement, says Peluther, we conceived the wildest fantasies, we brought forth litters of surmises. 94. Later, meshed in the throes of his ordeal, he finds himself struggling to discipline his thoughts, which carry with them a pregnant suggestion. 105. In Dorian Gray, The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and A. B. O., however, the range of what Elaine Showalter describes as the living symbols of the devolutionary force of male vice must be extended to include a deteriorative quality inherent in the species, a quality not necessarily limited to or apparent only in misbegotten heirs, Nat as Lewis, for example, or Edith Beale's blighted child. 28. Even Beardsley's homunculi, appropriated for use in his coded language of concupiscence, had as their prototypes the embryos readily available to him in the first chapter of The Descent of Man, 1871, The Evidence of the Descent of Man from Some Lower Form, and in Volume 2, 1882, of Wilhelm His Anatomie Menschlicher Embryonen, 1880-85, figures 25 and 26. 29. Delamere's homunculus also owes its inception to the new biology, and specifically to the organic evolutionary studies of Ernst Heinrich Haeckel, the fiery apostle of Darwinism in Germany, rather than to what Showalter, noting the preponderance of misshapen offspring in fin de siècle literature, identifies as an evolving discourse revolving around the conflict between male and female writers over the representation of sexuality, through which the Literary uses and meaning of syphilitic insanity had been filtered. Point 30 Haeckel's theory that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny derived from evolutionary theory and introduced in his enormously influential General Morphology der Organismen, 1866, which Huxley called one of the greatest scientific works ever published, holds that the history of individual development, or ontogeny, is a short and quick recapitulation of paleontological development, or phylogeny, dependent on the laws of inheritance and adaptation. 31 The concept was not entirely original with Haeckel, for already emergent by the late 18th century the law of recapitulation itself was, as Stephen Jay Gould has noted, discovered many times in the decade following 1859. 32 Darwin, for example, had suggested in On the Origin of Species that the embryo comes to be left as a sort of picture, preserved by nature, of the ancient and less modified condition of each animal, although this represented a reversal of his earlier opinion on the matter, as expressed, for example, in a 1842 notebook jotting. It is not true that one passes through the form of a lower group, though no doubt fish more nearly related to fetal state 33 as early as 1838. However, Darwin had begun to contemplate the possibility that fetal monstrosity might be understood from a recapitulatory perspective, concluding that the foetus of man undergoes metamorphosis and that the kind of monstrosity might be determined by the age of foetus 34, whereas at mid-century such speculations had been largely confined to scientific treatises. By the century's close the concept of recapitulation was surfacing in unexpected places, having been appropriated as an explanatory model within widely differing fields. Thus, one encounters Haeckel's premise that the history of the germ is an epitome of the history of the descent of the tribe, redacted in a 1908 essay on ornament and crime by the Austrian architect Adolf Loos, who does away with annoying temporal constraints. Haeckel's short and quick recapitulation of paleontological development, and guilelessly blends orders, categories, genera, and disciplines. At the moment of birth, human sensations are equal to those of a newborn dog. His childhood passes through all the transformations which correspond to the history of mankind. At the age of 2, he sees like a Papuan, at 4, like a Teuton, at 6 like Socrates, at 8 like Voltaire. When he is 8 years old, he becomes aware of violet, the color which the 18th century had discovered, because before that the violet was blue and the purple snail red. Today the physicist points to colors in the sun spectrum which already bear a name, whose recognition, however, is reserved for the coming generation. 35. It is worth noting, lest we be tempted to attribute Loos's revisionary tendencies to an insouciant spread of the layman's superstitious ignorance and misprision, that the social scientist Herbert Spencer had earlier supported the notion that intellectual and moral development proceed phylogenetically, just as grammar was made after language. He suggested, by way of example, so ought it to be taught after language, an inference which all who recognize the relationship between the evolution of the race and of the individual will see to be unavoidable, and in another context, a common trait of geographical models is that they carry each child's mind through a process like that which the mind of humanity at large has gone through. In essence, the education of the child must accord both in mode and arrangement with the education of mankind as considered historically, for if there be an order in which the human race has mastered its various kinds of knowledge, there will arise in every child an aptitude to acquire these kinds of knowledge in the same order. Thus, education should be a repetition of civilization in little. 36 As Gould points out, late 19th century education reformers, whose interests were pedagogical, linguistic, and anthropological, were also enthusiastic adherents of social recapitulation. He cites the example of several school boards that prescribed the Song of Hiawatha in early grades, reasoning that children, passing through the savage stage of their ancestral past, would identify with it. 37 Convinced that the mental development of the child corresponds in general to the chief phases in the development of his people or of mankind, Tuiskenziller, a 19th century German educational reformer, sought to implement a recapitulatory curriculum in which, as Gould notes, each of the 8 years of primary education would focus on the period of cultural and literary history that the child is recapitulating during the given year. Ziller offered the following core texts as part of prototypical recapitulatory curriculum. 1 Stories from epic folklore. 2 Robinson Crusoe, Rita Misselt in Germany. 3 Biblical patriarchs. 4 Judges of Israel. 5 Kings of Israel. 6 The life of Christ. 7 Apostolic history. 8 The Reformation. 38. Less interdisciplinary in his application of the concept, perhaps, than Loos or Ziller had been, Delamere betrays his own working knowledge of what Haeckel had established as a fundamental biogenetic principle in his rendering of the A, B, O, and in his having fixed at all on an abortion in which now lost ancestral morphological detail would be temporarily recovered, although he might also have fixed with impunity on a more fully developed child, since it had also been determined that vestiges of brute ancestry were readily apparent in human young, who were often styled little monkey by their mothers, because, as Alexander Francis Chamberlain notes in The Child as Revealer of the Past, their bodily characteristics smack of the monkey. 39 The defining features of Delamere's homunculus are its hideous and ungodly resemblance to the human face and its hairiness. Limago is the term that Darwin assigns in the descent of man to the fine wool-like hair that first develops on the eyebrows and face of the 5-month human fetus. Although it thickly covers the body by the 6th month, limago is largely shed at or shortly following birth, and Darwin associates this woolly covering with the first permanent coat of hair in those mammals which are born hairy. 40 Given the presence of the woolly hair or limago on the human foetus, and of rudimentary hair scattered over the body during maturity, Darwin went on to infer that man is descended from some animal which was born hairy and remained so during life. With its coarse lashes and tangled eyebrows, Delamere's hirsute creature uncannily resembles the early progenitors of man, resurgent only in utero, in children possessing a ring thatch, or in those cases in which hairiness in maturity signals a partial reversion to a lower animal type in idiots, for example, or in certain races whose hairiness is the result of reversion, unchecked by any form of selection. 41 Uncomfortable with the idea that the A, B, O, as aboriginal, resembles man in his earliest incarnation, a late Victorian reader would have been shocked to realize that, with its coarse fawn hair, it is a human being, though one that, arrested in the course of its gestation, has been unable to rid itself of the outward signs of its inherent bestiality. In this respect, A, B, O serves as a gauge registering the magnitude of the impact that Darwin's seminal 1859 publication, and its many influential offspring, had on horror fiction an impact, as Barton St. Armand reminds us, as dramatic as that which it had on the debate between science and religion, since Darwin's theory of evolution allowed for the possibility of new fictional monsters, the newest and most promising of the coming beasts being man himself. 42. In the spring of 1838, Darwin jotted down in Notebook C, the second of his self-described Transmutation of Species notebooks, an entry in which Bestiality if not explicit monstrosity and humanity are presented as homologous states of being. Let man visit orangutan in domestication, hear expressive whine, see its intelligence when spoken, as if it understood every word said, see its affection to those it knew, see its passion and rage, sulkiness, and very actions of despair. Let him look at savage, roasting his parent, naked, artless, not improving yet improvable, and then let him dare to boast of his proud preeminence. Works such as Darwin's The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals were attempts to replicate the encounter he visualized here, an epiphanic moment that he recognized as being terrifying but necessary, since it would serve to shock man, wonderful man, out of his complacent view of himself as a deity. 43a. B. O was born of the dramatic encounter between traditional beliefs and the staggering ideas put forth in the published writings, of which Darwin's impassioned entry served as an embryonic prelude. The unique originality of de la Mare's hitherto buried conceit is only partially traceable to such an origin. However, after all, monstrous progeny had made and were making their appearance in the physiognomic drawings of the 17th century French painter Charles L. Lebrun, figures 27a 27c. They appear as well in works ranging from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, to Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Macken's novel of the Black Seal, 1895, in which the reader encounters Gervase Craddock, out of whose body emerges a slimy, wavering tentacle, and Wells's Island of Dr. Moreau, with its curious collection of creatures, descendants, in all likelihood, of L. Lebrun's heroic little menagerie, possessing, in addition to the rough humanity of bodily form, the unmistakable mark of the beast, and even to Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror, 1929, in which Wilbur Woodley is described as partly human with very man-like hands and head, though his torso and lower parts of the body were teratologically fabulous. 44. In each of these fictions we experience some measure of the certain shock of which, as Huxley knew from his study of the relations of man to the lower animals, even the least thoughtful of men is conscious when brought face to face with these blurred copies of himself. That shock was due, he claimed, perhaps, not so much to disgust at the aspect of what looks like an insulting caricature, as to the awakening of a sudden and profound mistrust of time-honored theories and strongly rooted prejudices regarding his own position in nature, and his relations to the underworld of life, while that which remains a dim suspicion for the unthinking, becomes a vast argument, fraught with the deepest consequences, for all who are acquainted with the recent progress of the anatomical and physiological sciences. 45. The certain shock delivered by de la Mare's story differs somewhat from that which we encounter in stories or novels in which we stumble across what the disgusted Edward Prendick, viewing Moreau's morbid menagerie, decries as grotesque caricatures of humanity, beings in which, that is, essentially human qualities and conditions are aped and parroted, but otherwise preserved from utter subversion. 46. Although some remnant of humanity is vestigially present in such works, the caricature, more often than not, is rendered again, largely through an obvious contrivance sufficiently insulting to allow for its being banished to a separate plane of existence. Frankenstein's monster, although branding himself an abortion, is in fact a conglomerate man, patched and remnant, just as Moreau's mock men are manufactured, man-made. 47. Mr. Hyde makes his troglodytic appearance and evinces an ape-like fury only through the aid of compounded agents. 48. Craddock's physiognomic peculiarity is inherited. The blood of the little people is mixed with his own, as is that of Woodley, who is similarly miscegenetically situated, since his father was an extraterrestrial. Even Edward Jessop's ontogenetic denaturation to a small, not very formidable fur creature with the brain capacity of a gorilla in Paddy Chayefsky's Altered States, 1978, a 20th century testimony to the continuing appeal of recapitulation, comes about after he chemically alters his physiological state. 49. The monstrosity of de la Mare's aborted fetus, however, is a function of its humanity because it displays atavistic horrors always present in embryo but removed from sight in a fully gestated human body that has had time to compose itself. To be sure, A. B. O is not without its share of contrivances. Who so cared for the well-being of an abortion, for example, that he went to the length of supplying a map that would record its hiding place, a pipe for fresh air, and a label upon its leaden chest? And how comes it that the abortion is still living after so many years? But these devices are subordinated to the central image of fetus betrayed by its own evolutionary history, which the theory of recapitulation, unassailable at the time of the story's composition, had rendered thoroughly plausible. One is tempted to ask, with Michel Foucault, but what is it impossible to think, and what kind of impossibility are we faced with here? 50. In A. B. O. The kind of impossibility that de la Mare's readers are faced with is more willed than warranted, the consequence of Huxley's dim suspicion resisting vast argument. The question of what constitutes the impossible for Foucault arises in relation not to the strange categories and fantastic entities full of wonderment, exotic charm, and stark impossibility presented in a certain Chinese encyclopedia that he stumbled across in his reading of Borges, but rather to the narrowness of the distance separating them from categories to which one might assign a precise meaning, a demonstrable content, and very real animals such as stray dogs. For him impossibility seems to lurk in the oddity of unusual juxtapositions and the proximity of extremes. 51. In similar fashion, the certain shock that Huxley prophesies for his audience also originates in the blurring of fixed ideas, the blunting of necessary distinctions, the blasting of time-honored theories. All three theorizers, Foucault, and behind him, Borges, and behind him, Huxley, are directly concerned with the order of things. Huxley's On the Relations of Man to the Lower Animals, 1863, is an inquiry into the nature and the closeness of the ties which connect man with those singular creatures man-like apes whose history will provide some knowledge of man's position in the animate world, this knowledge itself being an indispensable preliminary to the proper understanding of his relations to the universe. Huxley founds his argument on scientific facts providing original answers to eternal riddles, although he grants that his solutions and systems are themselves little better than a mere approximation to the truth, only the latest in a succession of theoretical coverings and new habiliments that the human mind, fed by constant accessions of knowledge, regularly molds as it would any epistemic skin grown too constricting. 52. The passage that occasions Foucault's inquiry into the nature of words and things appears in a Borges essay devoted to the analytical language of John Wilkins, the 17th century English divine whose happy curiosities included the way in which human thought orders, classifies, and arranges the universe and the way in which language orders, classifies, and arranges human thought. Like Huxley, Borges treats all taxonomies and orders as provisional and arbitrary. Steadied by the faith of the forefathers whose featherbed of respected and respectable tradition he intends to rend to pieces, Huxley trusts in the existence of an orderly progress and governance of things, although they are not to be arrived at, he argues, if one only follows well-worn and comfortable tracks. To Borges, Wilkins's investigation suggests that there is no universe in the organic, unifying sense inherent in that ambitious word, and that even if there were, its purpose would be shrouded, encased in the hieroglyphics of God's secret dictionary, for which There is no key point 53 to lead him, in other words, to a very different conclusion from that at which Wilkins's contemporary, Sir Thomas Browne, to whose writings the archaeologically minded Voorhees and Huxley were equally devoted, had arrived in the faith-driven inquiries that make up so much of his Religio Medici, 1642. Admitting that it was impossible to directly comprehend the divine scheme, Browne saw nature as a vast compendium, a universal and public manuscript that, although written out in mystic letters and common hieroglyphics, revealed to the careful observer the wise dome of a maker who seldom alters or perverts and who, like an excellent artist, abhors deformity, inclining instead toward the rule of order and beauty. 54 For Huxley, however, nature defined herself in what earlier generations would have thought of as grotesque aberrations. Her insulting caricatures and singular creatures seemed to him to be the rule, and not, as they had been for Browne, exceptions, to be interpreted as a will deviation in the work of a skillful geometrician who prefers a straight and regular line but who occasionally swerves from an otherwise settled and constant course in order to acquaint the world with his prerogative to do so. 55 Voorhees would reinstate the supernatural, whose intervention in cosmic processes Huxley had strictly excluded, but like Huxley, he discerned in any divine impulse toward contrivance that might exist a bias toward those ingeniously wrought irregular parts that Browne isolated as the sometimes more remarkable threads interwoven throughout the principal fabric containing them. 56 For Huxley, as for Voorhees, those irregular parts constituted the foundational warp of the web of existence, and not merely its decorative weft. Browne was isolated from 19th century sappers of past histories by time and faith and by his devotion to the wisdom and general beauty of what had promoted the exercise of his doctor's faith. His conviction that nature is not at variance with art, nor art with nature, however, aptly describes the relationship between Huxley's speculations about nature, and those of his intellectual ilk, and the artistry of the fin de siècle fabula to which they may be said to have given rise, although Huxley himself had elsewhere recognized only an essential antagonism between the state of art and the state of nature. 57 Many late Victorian stories depend for their quotient of horror on the often shocking recalibration of an accepted system of false weights and mistaken measures, on the confounding of necessary divisions, on the collapsing of protective distances between extremities, and on the destabilizing of established orders. Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll, for example, describes himself as a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent denizens, all compact of mutually antagonistic good and evil, whereas Wilde's Dorian Gray is the complex multiform creature, 154, in whom corruption and beauty, among other things, are indistinguishable. 58 Stoker's Count Dracula is the undead, neither living nor dead but an unfathomable coniunctio of those opposing states of being. Macken's Hellenbaum, like the A, B, O and Wells's infinitely plastic beast. People, is both human and bestial. The heterogeneous condition foreground in these works is not limited to unnatural assimilations taking place within a single disorderly body. It often includes the subversion of boundaries separating autonomous bodies distanced, both physically and temporally. Though boxed, for example, the abortion of Delamere's story does not remain properly contained or repressed. Not merely repulsed by the abject body they find, Peluther and Dugdale are infected by their exposure to a homunculus whose unclean presence triggers a display of the beast/ancestor that should have been buried deep in the petrified strata of phyletic history, not quiescently awaiting its untimely resurrection in the body. Aware that he is wrestling with a dim skulking horror of soul and an inhuman depravity, Peluther realizes that all of his senses have failed him except his hearing, which has grown more keen. He notes that he felt his ears move and twitch, with the help of some ancient muscle long disused by humanity. 99,100. In The Descent of Man, Darwin had speculated that, in addition to having been covered with hair, the ears of the early progenitors of man were probably pointed, and capable of movement. 59 Not content, however, with distinguishing this as merely another in a string of offensive markers, the Ariadne thread running through the dehumanizing history he was determined to narrate. Darwin revealed that this mark of the beast lingered on in humans in one little peculiarity, consisting in a little blunt point, projecting from the inwardly folded margin, or helix towards the center of the ear, which was visible when the head is viewed from directly in front or behind, figure 28a. This galling remnant of the pointed ear of an ordinary quadruped termed the Darwinian tubercle was readily visible both in men and women who thus found themselves unexpectedly linked with those grotesque deviants, microcephalous idiots and savages and simulals who had been lumped together as reincarnated primitive. 60 The telltale point, however, constitutes one of those relics now become useless which, as Darwin noted, had been retained through inheritance, their function recalled only in the same involuntary and voluntary actions performed by animals nearly related to man, a recollection parroted, as one might say, in the effort that one of Dr. Moreau's ungainly attendants, a conscript in the good doctor's war on nature, is encouraged to make in order to suppress voluntarily the innate function of his pointed ears, covered with a fine brown fur. Figure 28b, point 61 Peluther responds equally involuntarily but only because he responds instinctively, viscerally to this reminder of his own hereditary uncleanliness. Dugdale's descent into primitivism is more powerfully expressed when, much later, he substitutes himself for the homunculus. Returning to Dugdale's house to help rebury the creature they have unearthed, Peluther finds his friend sitting hopelessly insane in the chest. By the story's end, Dugdale reverts, psychologically, if not bodily, to type. In his regressed state, this cultured man of letters even to the last, Peluther insists that he is a benevolent, kindly gentleman, fine in intellect, eccentric, not mad. 108 expresses himself in an idiom that lends credence to Lombroso's theory that, since no evolution is without its involution, no progress without an accompanying retrogression or a succeeding reaction, genius is merely a form of neurotic degeneration, an instance of the recurrence of atavism that, rather than a continuous rise to immeasurable heights of civilization, represents the future condition of any highly developed culture. 62 The reader has not been altogether unprepared for this eventuality. Acting throughout like innocent parodies of adolescent boys, Peluther and Dugdale manifest the signs of arrested sexual development that Lombroso took for one of the indices of the regressive atavism common to the higher degenerate. 63 Dugdale employs such terms such as spell icons that he has apparently not outgrown since his days as a young scholar at Eton or Rugby or Harrow, and he addresses the elderly Peluther by his boyhood nickname of Ratty. One might recall in this context another group of budding gentlemen whose innocent nicknames and adolescent expletives barely mask the brutish bent of their behavior. When Ralph, of Lord of the Flies, 1954, first realizes that he has become a castaway on a desert island while he still thinks, that is, that he has been dropped into the middle of the sort of glorious adventure described so often by Defoe, Weiss, and Ballantyne, though the idyll soon transforms itself into nightmare, his irrepressible joy at his unexpected good fortune is expressed in his own boy's language, SCHEAL. Wizza. Wacko, wizard, weaoo. Bong. Twink. 64 As William Golding's English schoolboys revert to a primitive state, so Pelluthor and Dugdale serve, in word and deed, as Delamere's sobering reminder that as Gilbert and Sullivan later so glibly put it. Darwinian man, though well behaved, / at best is only a monkey shaved. 65 While watching a beggar eat dinner, Pelluthor arrives at the same numbing conclusion that has unhinged Dugdale. Unwilling to remain alone in the house once the creature has barricaded itself in an upper chamber, Pelluthor invites first his neighbor's caretaker and then the beggar to dine with him. The latter's hunger prevents him from declining an offer that the uneasy caretaker will not accept, and so Pelluthor must watch as the scraggy wretch, as he calls him, guzzles the claret and gnaws bones and crust like a bony beast as he snarls, gobbles, puffs, mouths, and chaws. 104. Although he incites him to eat, drink, and be merry, Pelluthor is repelled by each deplorable action of the rude fellow and sickened at his beastliness. 104. The slang term beastliness here having a wonderfully ironic overtone. And then, just as he concludes that the man's belly was his only truth. 103. Pelluthor has an epiphany regarding the creature that is still lurking upstairs. He realizes that it is an abortion abortion, raised, as we have noted, from the belly of the earth. 106. Perhaps Pelluthor recognizes in the beggar some vestige of what Havelock Ellis claimed was discernible in the criminal type whose repulsive, hideous, repugnant lineaments made an unnamed journalist for Figaro, whose experience Ellis recounts. Imagine a sort of abortion. 66 This realization, however, carries with it what Dugdale calls a pregnant suggestion. 105 The abortion is abominable not merely because it stands as a physical emblem of monstrous and suppressed misdeeds, nor because it is so offensive to look at, but because it is, as the insane Dugdale intuits, neither man nor beast and once deciphered. This vile symbol hints at the dissolution of the ultimate, and psychologically necessary, boundary that, for the Victorian upper classes, still separated wonderful man from the beasts. It is a symbol of a hereditary and inheritable imposition that, before assuming the more material form of the mark of the beast, was taken for original sin. The notion of the dissolution of necessary boundaries emerges in in political and cultural as well as in physiological matters. If humanity suffers from indefinition, it follows that the systems it has devised to structure its society and clarify its Weltanschauung must partake of this indefinition, offering at best a superficial and ultimately false sense of security and stability. Darwin's theory hastened the demise of an already sorely beset notion so ubiquitous in English culture and society of a divinely sanctioned hierarchical system in which class-bound barriers were absolute, permanent, and impenetrable. Having dealt the second of what Freud would come to identify as the three severe blows, cosmological, biological, and psychological, by which the researches of science had shocked civilization out of its well-worn modes of thinking, Darwin checked the self-glorifying tendency to think that man was somehow different from animals or superior to them and that the acquisitions he had subsequently made had in any way succeeded in effacing the evidences, both in his physical structure and in his mental dispositions, of his parity with animals. 67 As the striker of the third, and, to his mind, the most decisive, blow, Freud himself would frequently return in his own writings to the notion that the same acquisitions, the whole sum of the achievements and the regulations which distinguish our lives from those of our animal ancestors that Darwin had discredited were innately flawed, continually inclining toward the purposelessness, chaos, and barbarity that had necessitated their creation. 68. In whatever way we may define the concept of civilization, he argued, it is a certain fact that all the things with which we seek to protect ourselves against the threats that emanate from the sources of suffering are part of that very civilization. 69 Freud's conclusions were not so very different from those of the anthropologists who had preceded him, who were no more hopeful than Chambers had been that irregular and undue impulses will ever be altogether banished from the system that, although they thought of it as becoming ever more just, faithful and benevolent, still had its origins in the sanguinary, aggressive, and deceitful character of the earlier human society that it had evolved to replace but could never render entirely extinct. 70 Like its precursors, Freud located the source of human discontent, the suffering, the misery, the heightened sense of anxious guilt and the consequent craving for punishment, the conterminous instincts of aggression and self-destruction in the mysterious depths of a species-wide consciousness, an original personality still untamed by civilization, and like them, he thought in terms of a prototypical crime originating in filial disobedience, which, for him, had patricide as its goal. 71. The first pages of evoke an atmosphere of guilt and horror along with an anxiety attendant upon a perceived threat to what George Eliot refers to as the liking to behold society well fenced and adorned with hereditary rank, which she saw as one of the quintessential English habits of feeling. 72 Just as Pelluthor struggles to protect himself from the creature that he has released from its subterranean prison, so he struggles with equal fervor, although far more covertly, to maintain his distance from members of his own society who seem, in his estimation, to be as monstrously predatory as the misshapen creature itself. Pelluthor is first lured from his study by a small but feisty boy, a descendant of the old London Liberty Boys and a contemporary of Sherlock Holmes's Baker Street irregulars, who, offended by Pelluthor's high-handed and peremptory inquisition, refuses to surrender Dugdale's note. Pelluthor does finally obtain the missive, but only after he has been bested in this initial encounter with a slip of a boy, who treats him like a felon out of stocks and goes off lustily whistling the Marseillaise. The introduction of the Marseillaise sounds the first note of conflict between Pelluthor's innate conservatism and reactionary tendencies and the spirit of social unrest embodied in the French Revolution, which still retains something of its old symbolic significance even in a Victorian Britain in which, as Josephine Guy suggests, historiography was informed by the Whiggish principle of gradualism which rejected wholesale the ideas of revolutionary change and collective activity and which had made the very idea of rupture inconceivable. 73 Initially, Pelluthor is eager to root this juvenile disturber of the peace, but later, terrified by the creature that has infiltrated his home, he seeks the companionship of someone from an even lower level of society, enticing the beggar, as we have seen, by mumbling such fragmentary and incoherent phrases, vaguely evocative of Fabian's social reforms, as he can muster under the circumstances. You shall eat a meal, poor man. How dire is civilization in rags, evil fortune. Socialism. Millionaires. I'll be bound. 102. The encounter reveals to the reader, though not to Pelluthor, that he and his guest are much more similar than he could have thought possible. The beggar attacks his food in much the same spirit with which Pelluthor and Dugdale, a little earlier, had undertaken their dicky guzzling, gnawing, snarling, gobbling, puffing, and chawing like a predatory beast, they digging, tugging, pulling, pushing, hauling, and scraping like two frenzied dogs that, certain of tangible rewards, exert themselves to uncover buried bones. Pelluthor sees the beggar as a bird of prey, a cat, a wild beast, and a man. 103. blind to the fact that he too, poisoned of origine, has been all these things, and to the fact that the taint of the primitive, the contamination to which he has always feared to expose himself, has never been external, but has always lurked within his own being, his own body and soul. Not merely politically conservative, Peluther and Dugdale are also conservators. As antiquarians they are also preservers of the past and devotees of the dead. Like the boundaries separating the upper from the lower classes, those separating the past from the present dissolve in A, B, O, which takes its place among those turn-of-the-century stories poised between a devotion to a past configured as a monument, commemorating the achievements of the descendants of the primitive type whom the misogynistic morale viewed as a masterpiece and model of creation, and a distrust of a past conceived of as a charnel house, containing the sordid remnants of bodies hosting diseases. Sufficiently virulent to wreak a mischievous vengeance on a living present. Point 74 like them. 2. It asks whether the strength and authority of received traditions and long-standing institutions are legitimately founded on the far-sighted wisdom of the giants of old beside whom contemporary men seem sadly diminished, or depend instead on what the anthropologist Sir James Fraser saw as beliefs which nowadays we should condemn unreservedly as superstitious and absurd. 75. The self-appointed keepers of codes and conventions that conveyed a reassuring but ultimately false sense of order and stability. Delamere's protagonists are willing victims of the myth of antiquity. Dugdale's letter to Peluther is meaningless, except for the word antiquities. The golden word, 95. The conjunction of the ancestors' map and their own antiquarian lust, however, sets into motion a process of self-discovery symbolized by the dig that discloses to the two men that the dead hand of the past can still reach out to destroy them. On the verge of insanity, Dugdale prophesies that if any suffer, it is you and I who must, his pronouncement recalling Pater's belief that man's physical organism is played upon not only by the physical conditions about it, but by remote laws of inheritance, the vibration of long-past acts reaching him in the midst of the new order of things in which he lives, itself a post-Darwinian variation on one of Hawthorne's favorite themes, the wrong doing of one generation that lives into the successive ones, and, divesting itself of every temporary advantage, becomes a pure and uncontrollable mischief. 76. Pater's conjecture, like Hawthorne's before him and Delamere's after, has its origin in Exodus, in which a jealous God visits the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Exodus 20:5.77. Dugdale and Peluther are the sons and heirs upon whom the iniquity of the fathers has been visited, which is only appropriate, given that they are fin de siècle versions of the anti-quarries, satirized by the elder Samuel Butler, who despised their own parents as too modern, and no better than upstarts, preferring to say to dust and worms you are my father, and to rottenness thou art my mother. 78. Antiquarianism can no longer sustain them, however, when, seated in the leaden coffin that once contained the abortion, Dugdale becomes aware of a deep abstract belief that rots into loathing. They believe that what they have uncovered is evidence of a sin perhaps of yours and of mine. In an apocalyptic world in which the Christian gods seem threatened by rough beasts slouching toward Bethlehem, the unclean sin transmissible from generation to generation is replaced by a beastliness inherent in the doctrine of heredity, which, according to Ellis, had assumed in the latter decades of the century a shape that was both ancient and modern, given that Plutarch had already expressed it in the following manner: that which is engendered is made of the very substance of a generating being, so that he bears in him something which is very justly punished or recompensed for him, for this something is he. Or again there is between the generating being and the generated a sort of hidden identity, capable of justly committing the second to all the consequences of an action committed by the first. 79. And let parents learn and remember that their prospective children will be the very images of themselves, and their children's destinies are thus placed completely within their control. Warren Fowler, the anthropologist's neo-Lamarckian sensibilities betraying themselves in his determined faith in the necessity for an individual agency sufficient to countercheck a hereditary predisposition toward degeneracy. The outlook for those who failed to keep this in mind seemed grim, for their sons and heirs were thereby destined to suffer in consequence of lustful ancestors consigned to the tombs long before their afflicted descendants saw the light. 80. Eliot might have had individuals like Dugdale and Peluther in mind when she spoke of those who preferred to see society well fenced and adorned with hereditary rank. As we have seen, however, their fears about the dissolution of necessary boundaries went well beyond the social to include the sexual, the biological, and the theological. In a deeper sense, A, B, O speaks about its protagonist's confrontation with things buried and repressed and occulted, things that come bursting through the tenuous crust of personality, that thin earth rind, as Carlyle called it, importuning interpretation. Point 81. For A, B, O is also, and perhaps primarily, a story about the act of reading itself, about deciphering hieroglyphic signs and visual symbols, about reconciling what is seen with what is known or thought to be known, about drifting into the liminal space that intervenes between language and the phenomena that it attempts to name, that gray, uncharted area in which interpretation goes forward, in which meaning is loosed from its moorings rather than anchored down, in which every depth of buried signification must be probed. The very title proves an exercise in cryptography and an anticipation, in pedo, of the process of discovery and annihilation that the impending engagement with the story will effect. The markings of A, B, O constitute a series of perverse prompters and false starts, having once given us pause to consider what little goes before and that little being of no very revealing nature where the acronyms, and the stories, meaning is concerned. Each colon urges us forward toward a terminating point that aborts the elements of speech and communication themselves. The markings bound material equally esoteric. Although it employs Roman characters, it also retains within itself the remnants of an earlier alphabet, for it begins with the first two letters and ends with the last letter of the Greek, alpha to beta to omega. Encoded within the proleptic device is a portentous coalescence of beginning and ending, of Genesis and Apocalypse, of the comprehensible and the unspeakable. We are baffled initially by the aborted message that introduces the story, and we begin to make sense of it only when it is too late to exit the tale, only, that is, after we have been caught up in and contaminated by its contents. In luring us into the attempt to decipher the cryptograph at once title, creature, and text, and thus to determine the exact correlation between the word and the body, Delamere establishes an uncomfortable kinship between the story's main characters and the reader who doubles for them. Our own efforts to pull meaning from the belly of the story are echoed in those of the two characters who are continually adjusting ill-fitting spectacles as they struggle to decode missives and maps that will enable them to pull their treasure out of the belly of the earth. The instructions recorded on the fateful treasure map, conveyed in divers scrawls in red ink, and crazy figures, baffle but do not dissuade them because they believe that haste spelled glory. 95 to 96. Moments before he begins the dig, and equipped with a yard measure, Dugdale commences to read the chart. Yes, tree 10 yards and by 73 semicircum square. It's mere ABC, P-O-N my word. Its mutterings, however, make little sense, and the treasure they uncover, of course, proves to be much more than mere ABC. It is the horrific A, B, O Their reading of the various texts is informed by assumptions and expectations not very much more sophisticated than those that other readers once brought to novels by Henty or Marryat, in which haste did spell nothing but glory, or to a primer in which C always does follow B, as B follows A. Thus, all else but the provocative reference to antiquities might be meaningless, as indeed it was, as Pellew remarks concerning Dugdale's first cryptic message, written in a fever and composed of a series of nominals antiquities, the lumber a mere scrawl signaling almost nothing and lacking all coherence outside of the specific context of cultural and historical knowledge necessary for its proper deciphering. Pellew is not put off by this linguistic underspecification, for he is sufficiently traveled in those realms of knowledge to suffer little more than a comfortable titillation when confronted by the semantic indeterminacy of the missive. The subsequent transcription of the anomalous map, however, leads not to the anticipated ends and the fixed finalities that the precursor text promises, but to a grave obscure that complicates the act of reading itself, here presented as a ritualized convention in which meanings have been established before any conning need take place, in which knowledge is secured without the requirement of laborious thinking, in which one asks, as Pellew does, what does it mean, for mere custom's sake? Because one does not expect to learn any more than custom has already taught. The portrayal of Dugdale's descent into madness proves the more unnerving of the two climaxes following the decoding of the map, for it delivers to the reader a variation of the certain shock consequent, according to Huxley, upon the caricaturing blurring of fixed models and types, in this case the literary conventions, traditional themes, and received structures that Delamere imports in order that he may violate them, and through them, the complacent expectations and shop-worn assumptions that impede and abort the phenomenon of recognition and revelation that reading is intended to facilitate. Two of those themes concern buried treasures and antiquarianism, the double helix themes to which we have already referred, both of which are given play in The Gold Bug, 1843, Poe's prize-winning tale of ratiocination that employs the very conventions that the later author would turn to his own purpose. Although lacking the dry-as-dust pedantry of Delamere's scholars/adventurers, Poe's William Legrand is well educated, his misanthropy and familiarity with entomological lore testifying to his antiquarian sensibilities. Moreover, he is a confident cryptographer happily, since a rare and happy accident puts him in the way of the treasure map and, through it, hidden riches. In The Gold Bug, as in A, B, O, that which is sought is found by Midstudy, at which point it becomes clear that the delicate merchandise has its origin in guilt and sin. In both cases the climactic disclosure is subtly deflated, however, for it is not the thematic end itself, only a means of preparing the way for a subsequent end. More sublime revelation, one which, in both pieces, is predicated upon further deciphering. When it comes to the nature of what is to be revealed, however, the twin texts part company. Poe's Legrand takes possession of a treasure of incalculable value, a chest containing valuables heaped promiscuously, gold, not a particle of silver, diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, and then embarks upon a lengthy disquisition in which he reveals the necessary conjunction of common sense and poetical consistency that had enabled him to decode the instructions that have led him to a vaster wealth than even he had anticipated. Point 82 His conjectures, as he goes to great lengths to make clear to his audience, have been correct in almost every detail. A singular coincidence, 3:829, a skull discovered on the underside of the fragment of parchment upon which he has drawn a picture of the death's head beetle baffles him only temporarily, for he becomes certain that a kind of connection links these seemingly disparate episodes and thus begins the process of forging the great chain, 3:831, that leads him to his fortune. His recognition that the skull is a piratical emblem and that the figure of the goat drawn in the opposite corner of the parchment is the hieroglyphical signature, 3:833, of Captain Kidd permits him to conclude that a series of accidents and coincidences very extraordinary, 3:833, has put him in possession of a treasure map that once belonged to that notorious pirate. The whole mystery is eventually laid bare to him, and he has little difficulty in solving, 3:831, the other problems that arise. He is sustained by a deep-seated conviction that he is not laboring in vain, 3:843, and he suffers only the bare minimum of setbacks without which his adventure would lack the requisite dramatic leavening the doubts that threaten but ultimately fail to weaken his certainty that nothing can go amiss because no event, no matter how accidental in seeming, is entirely without significance. Whereas his willfully skeptical friend wanders continually in the dark, 3:840, early on misconstruing Legrand's insights as a species of nervous empressement, 3:814, a feverish aberration of mind, 3:817, and lunacy, 3:819, and his bug business, 3:816, as a nonsensical crochet, 3:813, Legrand discerns only a gradually evolving web of sense. Irresistibly impressed with the presentiment of some vast good fortune impending, 3:833, armed with the knowledge amounting to certainty that ciphers do in fact convey a meaning, and inspired by the conviction that it may well be doubted whether human ingenuity can construct an enigma of the kind which human ingenuity may not, by proper application, resolve, 3:834-35, Legrand searches for the text for my context, 3:833. As Thomas Dunn English noted long ago, The Gold Bug represented Poe's attempt to carry out his idea of the perfection of the plot, in which, as Poe explained in The Philosophy of Composition, 1846, no one point is referable either to accident or intuition, and the process of literary composition itself proceeds step by step, to its completion with the precision and rigid consequence of a mathematical problem. 83 Such a perfected plot was, as Poe acknowledged in Eureka, really, or practically, unattainable but only because it is a finite intelligence that constructs. In other words, the artist's finite intelligence only dimly echoes an infinite one, and the artistic conception reconstructs modestly, and in miniature the universe that Poe would come to view as a plot of God, unflawed because by definition the plots of God are perfect. 80. Although an incredulous Daniel Kempton dismisses Legrand as a man whose self-fulfilling desire for riches is driven by the Christian's paranoia, as if temporal reality were a kind of cipher, or encoded message, written for the elect by the hand of God, we might wonder instead whether Legrand, like the narrator of Miss Found in a Bottle, 1833, is not one of Poe's inspired romantics whose senses have not been sealed to the meaning of the occult hints expressed in an extraordinary series of accidents or coincidences apparently predetermined by a vast and organizing consciousness whose actions favor Legrand in a way that they did not favor the hapless coadjutors whose bodies are buried with Kidd's treasure. 85 In any event, Legrand's explication of his methods exceedingly clear, and, although ingenious, still simple and explicit, 3:842, might be said to reproduce stylistically a passage from a leaf of the universal manuscript that contains the plots of God. Whereas Legrand's intellectual labors are expended in his effort to uncover the text that lends prosaic credence to the context foretold by the telltale clues brought to light with the revelation of the death's head skull, those of the two boys in the plot of Delamere's story properly begin only after an excavation has been triumphantly embarked upon. Denied the confused heap of gold and of jewels, 3:826, with which Legrand's efforts are rewarded, Dugdale begins the process of composing the text called for by the revised context revealed by the awful terror of the event which has come upon him. Attempting, in the fashion of post-madman, to write sanely and to discipline the mutinous thoughts that threaten to overmaster him, Dugdale writes a letter in which he admits that his systems and his codes have crumbled and that he is lost. Science is slunk away shamefaced. He laments. Religion is a withered flower. Oh, my friend, what shall I say? How shall I regain myself? Its most basic expectations. As to the underlying nature of things, acquired by rote from the books that now seem to him to be disconsolate friends offended, have failed him and are now superseded by an oppressive sense that the world is in fact the sort of place that Pater had described, in his imaginary portrait Duke Carlo Rosenmold, 1887, as being buried made and remade of the dead its entire fabric of politics, of art, of custom, being essentially heraldic achievements, dead men's mementos. 86. Dugdale's mad ravings constitute a final text that more accurately renders the proportions of the frightful universe concerning which his prefatory letter offers only broad hints. Huddled in the casket and clutching a Bible to his side, he commences a rambling, disjointed monologue, part funeral sermon, part philosophical disquisition, which begins with the quotation from Job that will serve as his text. For we are but of yesterday and know nothing, because our days upon earth are a shadow. What is life? Peluther. A vain longing for death. What is beauty? A question of degree. And sin is in the air, child of disease and death, and springing up and hatred of life. Fawn hair has beauty, and as for bones, surely less for the worms. Worms. Through lead. Peluther, my dear old pal. Through lead. But the sunlight has no meaning to me now. That breeder of corruption, tall here and a monstrous being, walks under my skull, strangling all the other beings, puny and sapless. I have one idea, conception, vivid faintness, a fierce red horrid idea, and a phenomenon, too. You see, it is when a deep abstract belief rots into loathing, when hope is eaten away by horrors of sleep and a mad longing for sleep mad. Yet fawn hair is not without beauty, provided, Peluther, provided through Lee. 107-8. Dugdale's rantings, though enigmatic, are susceptible to reconstruction, in part because they invoke as simultaneous points of reference and departure the very texts that had until then formed the basis of his experience. Memorable to him, clutched to his bosom as a type of his own experiences even as his madness impends, is the story of Job, whose lamentations are echoed throughout Dugdale's De Profundities. Just as Dugdale rejects the sunlight as something holding no meaning to me now, so Job curses the day of his birth, saying, let that day be darkness, Job 3:4, because it shut not up the doors of my mother's womb, 3:10, leaving him to be born, live his life, suffer, and be left at length to wonder why he had not died from the womb, 3:11. Why, he wonders, could his not have been an hidden untimely birth, so that he could have been one of the infants which never saw light, 3:16. Taking the place of the wretched abortion within the chest that he had planned to rebury once the darkness comes down to cloak our horrid task from the eyes of the world, Dugdale also apparently comprehends, at last, that there is some connection between himself and the creature whose hidden untimely rebirth has destroyed his very sanity. And just as, with a horde of thoughts pressing upon him, Dugdale contemplates the awful terror of the event that has come upon him and Peluther, so Job is stunned to think that though bereft of safety, rest, and quiet, yet trouble came, 3:26, for the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me, 3:25. Job, however, is eventually comforted, for the evil that the Lord had brought upon him, Job 42:11, passes away, and he is rewarded with twice as much as he had before, 42:10, his sufferings, granted answers to his plaintive questionings, and given a glimpse of things too wonderful for me, which I knew not, 42:3, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seek thee, 42:5. Dugdale, on the other hand, has caught a final glimpse of things too horrific for him, things of which he knew nothing, and his confused monologue suggests something of the depths that he has plumbed and the spiritual degeneration that he has suffered as a consequence. Even in the midst of his despair, Job finds comfort in the thought that the grave will consume the sinner, that the womb shall forget him, the worm shall feed sweetly on him, he shall be no more remembered, and wickedness shall be broken as a tree. Job 24:20, Dugdale's compulsive reiteration of a single question, worms, through lead, through lead, through lead, serves as a fragmentary meditation on corruption and on the reality that, because worms cannot penetrate lead, the pestilent secret sin that should have been consumed long ago, and so remained forever hidden from the eyes of the sane, has instead lived on, festering, weaving snares, befouling the wholesome air, awaiting the day when it could creep out and go stalking midst healthy men. 106. In a world in which worms cannot eat through lead, in which corpses do not decay, the litany of questions and answers appearing in the burial service of the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer, how is the dead, with what body shall they come? Doubtful, that which thou sawest is not quickened, except it die lose their power to console the mourner with the assurance that death and decay are necessary precursors to eternal life. 87. The recipient of a different order of revelation, Dugdale acquires the spiritual insight that transforms him into a raving lunatic and strips him of the abilities that the Victorians valued most highly, the ability to be rational, to maintain one's wits in the face of unfathomable darkness, even as one denied that such darkness existed, and to continue to struggle to make sense of what might in fact prove in the end to be utterly incomprehensible. He is a type of the sick soul whose plight William James analyzes in the Varieties of Religious Experience, which concerns itself with the more regenerate sorts of happiness, the phenomenon of conversion or religious regeneration, and the obverse of this state of healthy-mindedness, with a condition of negativity and deadness and a consciousness of evil. To the sick soul suddenly overwhelmed not by the conception or intellectual perception of evil, but by the grisly blood-freezing heart-palsying sensation of it close upon him, the face of nature is transfigured in the reverse direction and the whole expression of reality transformed. The world now looks remote, strange, sinister, uncanny. Its color is gone, its breath is cold, there is no speculation in the eyes it glares with. I can no longer find myself, I walk, but what? I weep false tears, I have unreal hands, the things I see are not real things. Such are expressions that naturally rise to the lips of melancholy subjects describing their changed state. 88. Dugdale is one of those melancholy subjects who may be said to have undergone an inverted conversion experience, which imparts neither the vision of wonderful things that makes Job's latter days happier than his earlier ones, nor the glowworm-like conception of that truth that Legrand's adventure brings to so magnificent a demonstration, Poe 3:829, but rather a deep abstract belief that rots into loathing. In the end he is obsessed with 1. Fears red horrid idea, which is a phenomenon, 2. And seems to appertain to the fawn hair to which his wandering thoughts, otherwise focused on the monstrous being that walks under my skull strangling all the other beings, return as to a riddle in need of solution. If, as Darwin speculated in a notebook jotting of 1838, nature does nothing in vain, and if it is also true, as Sir Thomas Browne suggested, in a passage from Religio Medici that Darwin had copied into his notebook, just lines before his own comment on the expediency of nature's efforts, that nothing in nature is ugly or misshapen, because nature is the art of God, then only false expectations or flawed conceptions of the nature of God could blind one to the beauty of fawn hair. 89 Trapped in a post-Darwinian world, annihilated by the revelation that fawn hair has beauty, Dugdale finds in the face that nature has turned upon him evidence that, although perfect of its kind, the plot of the universe is more sinister than he had been led to expect, and the inevitable conclusion is that the contriver thereof must be a monstrum artifex. Again, we find ourselves in Poe's universe, in which not man but the conqueror worm is the hero of the tragedy that bears his name, and in which much of madness, and more of sin, and horror proves to be the soul of the plot. Just as, so Muller tells us, it was the custom of Nebuchadnezzar to have his name stamped on every brick that was used during his reign in erecting his colossal palaces so that, when they fell into ruins and the ruins were carried away for building new cities, other kings might discover the clear traces of that royal signature. So the face of the abortion bears the stamp of its creator, and in the same way, the prose of Dugdale's final speech bears not only the markings of his insanity but also the vestiges of his worldview, his knowledge, his experience, his most basic assumptions in the realms of theology, biology, aesthetic structures all suddenly antiquated, all suddenly collapsing into ruin. 90 The passage containing Dugdale's appositional renaming of the sin that saturates the air draws its distinctive cadences from a repetition, or parataxis, child of diseases and death and springing up and hatred of life that is characteristic of archaic prose styles in which simple or naive coordination conveys faith-driven truths. Pater too had employed a paratactical construction in the section of his conclusion in which he charts a movement from birth to death to a kind of resurrection, noting, in a line powerfully reminiscent of Dugdale's, that the elements of which we are composed are driven in many currents, and birth and gesture and death and the springing of violets from the grave are but a few out of 10,000 resultant combinations. Emphasis. Mine. 91 It is the same construction that we find in the burial service in the Book of Common Prayer, which tells how, on Judgment Day, the trump shall blow, and the dead shall rise incorruptible, and we shall be changed. 205. Both de la Mare's story and Pater's manifesto appropriate the language and rhythms of biblical speech in order to imbue their own heretical gospels with an authority that they would otherwise lack. Exploring the occult means by which a sharp and importunate reality dissolves into a group of impressions unstable, flickering, inconsistent, which in turn are reduced to a single sharp impression, Pater attempts to characterize the experience through which one might achieve a variegated, dramatic life. 92 In the world according to Pater, the mysterious process whereby one passes swiftly from the external world of concrete phenomena to the inner world of thought and feeling may be understood only by an act of faith like that called for in the Book of Common Prayer, which reveals the mystery whereby this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality, at which time death will be swallowed up in victory. 205. For the older faith that would have discovered meanings in the mysteries expressed in the archaic structures and cadences of such ancestral texts, A, B, O substitutes uncertainty, skepticism, and doubt. At the last, Dugdale could not answer why stand we all then in naivety. 294, could no longer believe that there is one manner of fleshy of men, and other manner of fleshy of beasts. 204, and would have strong reason to doubt that what is sound in corruption, resitheth in incorruption, or that what is sound in disianur, resitheth in honor, or that what is sound in natural body, resitheth in a spiritual body. 205. Linguistically and stylistically reversionary, the language of Dugdale's final speech undermines the comfortable faith in words reference to things and displays the ruptures and discontinuities that, according to Gayatri Spivak, are uniquely characteristic of the true decadence of a literary language. 93. Inasmuch as he would later remind us of an important truth, namely, that the first essential purpose in literature is to delight us, we ought not to be surprised that the mature de la Mare would not readily have admitted to having nursed such peccant fancies. 94 We can also begin to appreciate, however, why the young de la Mare, despite the fact that he would soon be designated the poet of childhood, might have been fascinated by the image of a buried, and still living, abortion. In one sense the story served as a boyish prank, the expression of a rebellious youth attempting to cast himself, however surreptitiously, in the role of what one contemporary critic decried as the latter-day literary abortion, the youthful decadent. 95 The desire to place oneself beyond the pale of bourgeois respectabilities, or at least to appear to do so, would have been understandable in a young and self-conscious artist looking to make his mark in the realm of English letters at the turn of the century, or, in any event, before Wilde's 1895 trial made flouting conventional wisdom seem a dangerous pastime. Holbrook Jackson reminds us, for example, of Max Beerbohm's belief that many of his own earlier drawings, which seemed morbid and horrible, were the outcome of a very natural boyish desire to shock conventional folk. 96a, B, O is also, however, one of those texts called for by the irrevocably altered context, social, cultural, and intellectual, that Darwin, Huxley, Haeckel, and others had made it impossible to ignore. If nothing else, A, B, O remains as one of those poor relics that, simply because they serve their temporary purpose, but no other, are saliently characteristic of their day. These are de la Mare's own words, written 30 years after the composition of A, B, O in his introduction to the 1880s. These poor relics, the stillborn, the dry as dust, the dejected inmates of the 2D box, he calls them, could have come into being only when and where they did. 97a, B, O, and stories like it, such consummate products of their place and time, open for us one more window on the fin de siècle mentale, providing us with important insights into the uneasy period during which the Victorian age was in its death throes, even as the coming beast was waiting to be born.